Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome. So today, we're diving into a really pivotal time in Japanese history, the early Meiji era.
Right, a period where just so much was happening, incredibly fast. Japan looking outwards, trying to modernize.
Exactly. And we want to explore some of the, reactions and the challenges that came with all this change. We'll focus specifically on two groups:
hmm
the farmers, the people working the land, and former samurai, the Shizoku.
Yeah, understanding their experiences really gives you a sense of the social undercurrents, doesn't it? The tensions beneath the surface of all that modernization.
Definitely. So let's start with the farmers. What was going on with them?
Well, the Meiji government, they needed serious money, right, to fund all these modernization projects.
Okay, like infrastructure, military.
Exactly. And a primary source for that funding became the land tax, which fell heavily, really heavily on the farmers.
And not just a small increase then, a significant burden.
Oh, yeah. It fundamentally changed things. It wasn't just about livelihood anymore. Their land was now, a key revenue source for the state. That created a lot of resentment.
I can imagine. And it wasn't just the money, was it? There were other things being imposed on them.
Precisely. On top of the taxes, you had conscription introduced.
Ah, military service.
Right. Young men suddenly required to serve in the army. And then there were deliberate efforts to change traditional ways of life, things that had been done for generations.
So heavy taxes, sons being taken for the army, forced changes to traditions. That sounds like a recipe for discontent.
And it was. It wasn't just quiet grumbling either.
Wow.
No, the historical record shows frequent uprisings. Farmer uprisings were pretty common in this early Meiji period.
Wow. Okay, so what were they actually demanding in these uprisings? Was it just about the taxes and conscription?
Those were definitely major points, yes. Opposition to the land tax, opposition to conscription. But it gets more, well, interesting. Some protests actually demanded the closure of the new elementary schools the government was setting up.
Elementary school. Why would they oppose schools? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? It suggests maybe these schools were seen as another unwelcome imposition, maybe disrupting community life or perhaps imposing values they didn't agree with.
Okay. Or maybe they just needed the children for farm labor.
That's certainly possible, too. And it wasn't always about rejecting the new, either. Some uprisings actually seemed aimed at preserving parts of the old order,
Like what?
like protesting the removal of the old domain governors after the Han system was abolished. So a kind of resistance to losing familiar authority figures.
I see. And didn't you mention something about disease prevention, too?
Yes, there was even resistance to new infectious disease prevention measures, a suspicion perhaps of these modern state-imposed health interventions compared to traditional ways.
Fascinating. So a real mix of grievances. Do we see a pattern in these uprisings over time?
Yeah, if you look at the data, the general trend shows the number of these farmer uprisings. Well, it's clearly increasing in the years leading up to about 1884. There's an upward curve.
So growing unrest in the countryside. Okay. Now, what about the other group we mentioned, the Shizoku? The former samurai. They weren't happy either, were they?
Not at all. Their world was being turned upside down, perhaps even more dramatically than the farmers. They were losing all their traditional feudal
Their
privileges.
special status, basically.
Exactly. Their social standing, which had been absolutely central to their identity for centuries, was just evaporating in this new Meiji society. It was an existential crisis for many.
And economically.
Mm.
Were they okay?
Many were in dire straits. Their traditional income, the hereditary stipends or kuroku, were being phased out and eventually eliminated altogether.
Right, the Kuroku. That must have hit hard.
Immensely hard. Suddenly, they had no guaranteed income, and many just didn't have the skills or connections to succeed in the new economy. This economic hardship was a huge factor in their dissatisfaction.
So you've got angry farmers and struggling, disenfranchised former samurai. That feels like a volatile mix. Did this feed into wider political movements?
It absolutely did. All this discontent kind of fueled the push for political change, particularly the call for a national assembly.
Ah, okay. So demands for more representation. Was this idea coming from the disenfranchised groups themselves?
Well, interestingly, the idea of a constitutional government wasn't entirely new, even within the government. Some leaders recognized early on that Japan needed some form of broader participation to strengthen itself, especially against the Western powers.
A pragmatic reason then, not purely democratic ideals.
Yeah, it was partly about national strength and unity in a dangerous world, but progress was very slow.
Why was that? Internal disagreements.
Partly, yes. But also, power was really concentrated in the hands of a few key figures, mostly from the Satsuma and Choshu domains, the domains that had led the restoration.
Right, the so-called Meiji oligarchs. They weren't keen on sharing power, I suppose.
Not particularly, no, and this concentration of power caused its own friction.
So how did the call for an assembly gain real momentum?
A key moment was in 1874. Some prominent figures who had actually been high up in the government but had resigned,
Who are we talking about?
people like Itagaki Taisuke and Goto Shujiro, they'd left over the Sakenran debate, that argument about whether to invade Korea.
Ah, right, the Conquer Korea debate.
Yes. So they submitted a formal petition calling for a popularly elected assembly, a Minsen Jin.
What was their main argument?
Basically, they argued that having just a few leaders making all the decisions, this kind of autocratic rule, was actually dangerous for Japan.
How so?
They believed a parliament was needed to bring the government officials and the people together, to unite everyone in rebuilding the nation and making it strong.
So unity and strength again,
Yeah.
a national project.
Exactly. And this petition, it really sparked a huge debate. Newspapers, magazines, suddenly everyone was talking about whether Japan needed a national assembly.
And this helped fuel that movement you mentioned.
Yes, the freedom and people's rights movement, the Jiyu Minkin Undo, it really took off, and it found a lot of its support among those dissatisfied Shizoku we were just talking about.
Makes sense. They felt left out of the new system.
Yeah.
So the government's under pressure now. How did they respond? Did they just ignore it?
They couldn't really ignore it. In 1875, they tried to manage the situation. There was the Osaka Conference where they met with Itagaki and others.
Trying to find some common ground?
Sort of. The outcome was an imperial decree promising that constitutional government would be established gradually.
Ah, gradually. The classic political move.
Yes. Not immediately, but eventually. And they did take some concrete steps. They set up the Genroin, the Council of Elders.
An advisory body.
Yes, appointed members advising on legislation. They also created the Daishinin, the Supreme Court, to organize the judiciary. And they started holding conferences for local governors to talk about maybe setting up local assemblies.
So building some structures, laying some groundwork, it sounds like concessions, but were they also cracking down?
Oh, definitely. At the same time, they were tightening control. They brought in the newspaper ordinance and the slander law, aimed squarely at suppressing criticism and any anti-government movements they saw as too radical. So it was this dual approach. Offer some slow reforms, but clamp down hard on dissent.
That tension, offering hope but also suppressing voices, seems likely to just make things worse, especially for the Shizoku.
And it did. The discontent just kept building. It wasn't just petitions and debates anymore. It turned violent.
Billions.
Yes. Even before the Osaka Conference, back in 1874, you had Eito Shinpei, remember, one of the guys who signed the assembly petition leading disgruntled Shizoku in revolt in his home province, the Saga Rebellion.
And the government put it down.
With military force, yes. But it didn't stop there. Things got even more tense later.
What happened?
Well, the government made two moves that were deeply symbolic and economically painful for the Shizoku. They abolished the right to carry swords.
The ultimate samurai symbol.
Exactly. And they fully eliminated those hereditary stipends, the kuroku.
Pulling the rug out from under them completely.
Pretty much. And in 1876, bang, 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 a series of Shizoku rebellions break out. The Kishinto Rebellion in Kumamoto, the Akizuki Rebellion in Fukuoka, the Hagi Rebellion in Yamaguchi.
Wow, all in 1 year. Desperate acts.
They were expressions of real anger and desperation, but these were preludes, really.
To the big one.
To the big one, the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877.
Led by Saigo Takamori. A huge figure from the Restoration itself. That's ironic.
Hugely ironic. Saigo, this hero of the Restoration, leading around 40,000 samurai from Kagoshima, his home domain.
40,000? That's enormous.
It was a massive uprising against the very government he helped create. This was a serious, serious challenge for the Meiji state.
How did the government even cope with that?
They had to mobilize everything, their new conscript army, other forces. It was a major test for this modern military they were building.
And the fighting.
It was incredibly fierce. It raged across Kyushu for about 8 months.
8 months, wow. Any particular battle stand out?
The Battle of Tabaruzaka is often highlighted. Really intense fighting there. It kind of symbolized the clash, the determination of the samurai against the firepower and organization of the new government army.
And the new army won.
Ultimately, yes. The government forces suppressed the rebellion. It was a bloody and difficult victory, but they did it.
And that was basically the end for large-scale samurai resistance.
Pretty much. The Satsuma Rebellion's defeat really solidified the Meiji government's power.
Mhm.
It showed they could overcome even this kind of massive internal challenge, but the human cost was immense.
For the rebels, obviously, but what about the leadership?
Huge losses there, too.
Hmm.
During the rebellion itself, Kido Takayoshi, another key Meiji leader, died of illness.
Okay.
Saigo Takamori himself was killed in the final battle, a tragic end for him.
Became a sort of folk hero, didn't he, despite rebelling?
He did, yeah. A symbol of the lost samurai spirit for some. And then the very next year, 1878, Okubo Toshimichi.
Another one of the main leaders.
Yes, assassinated by disgruntled Shizoku who blamed him for the changes.
So Kido, Saigo, Okubo, the three biggest names of the Restoration, all gone within about a year or so.
Exactly. It truly marked the end of an era. Their passing really cleared the way for the next generation of leaders to step up. People like Okuma Shigenobu, Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo. They were the ones who would steer Japan forward from there.
It really paints a picture of the early Meiji era as much more complex than just, modernization happened. It was incredibly turbulent.
Absolutely. You had profound upheaval, the farmers dealing with heavy burdens, the samurai losing their entire world. It just highlights how difficult and contested rapid top-down transformation really is.
Yeah, the resistance wasn't just random. The push for an assembly, the rebellions, these were reactions that fundamentally shaped how Japan's politics developed.
It really did. These
Um,
conflicts were critical moments.
So thinking about all this, you have these very different reactions, right? The farmers' protests often focused on quite local, immediate issues like taxes or schools. And then the Shizoku rebellions, which seemed tied to lost status and sometimes had broader political aims like influencing the government's direction. What does that disparity tell us about how different groups within a society actually experience and react to these huge, sweeping changes? And maybe, how might these early conflicts, this period of intense struggle, have subtly shaped the specific path Japan took in the decades afterwards?
Yeah.
Something to think about.